Right. Well, right now, let's bring in Jake Wallis-Simons. He's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle and joins us again. Good afternoon to you, Jake.
Good afternoon.
I think it's just been a very, very difficult weekend. I was speaking to a number of people, actually people getting in touch with me from the Jewish community in this country. I live in North London. People I barely knew, some people I didn't know at all, people coming up to me in the supermarket, people getting in touch on social media and just saying how fearful they were that particularly what the events going on in the Middle East, but also them being brought onto the streets of our capital and many other cities around this country where people were so openly dismissive of the massacre of what we now know to be 1,400 Israelis, the vast majority of whom were innocent people. They're not the civilians, not so vast majority innocent, vast majority civilians. People just having, families in their beds, children, elderly, and people at a music festival. How concerned should people be that we have imported this hatred of not just Israelis, but also of Jews?
I think people should be very concerned because when you look at the social movements in our country, on the left, and the further you go to the left, the more of a problem it is, you find this spectrum of support, essentially, for a jihadi movement. And it's astonishing that in 2023, the horseshoe of politics can be such that you find the most vocal expressions of support for jihadism on the left. If you examine the people who were on those demonstrations over the weekend, you had actual jihadists there. You had people who were calling for the deaths of Jews. In fact, one person brought a knife to the demonstration and threatened to behead a brave Iranian protester who was standing up for Israel. So you had those guys with their jihadi flags and slogans and all the rest of it who should have been arrested and in most cases weren't, probably because of the lack of resources. But then around them, you had various coronas of sympathizers. And those people really forms quite a large segment of the population who are animated to come out onto the streets because they broadly sympathize with the Palestinians, which is fine, but they sympathize with them in a way that it feels is blinded to the fact that we've seen the worst jihadi attack in history that's taken place on Jews. Their instinctive response is not to stand up for those innocent Jews, but to stand up for the Palestinians, even though the perpetrators were Hamas. I think that's a really serious problem because in the end, this isn't really about Jews. This is about Western civilization. This is about our shared values with Israel and about our ways of life. And the people who are tempted to support Hamas and to support the Palestinians in a way that it gives a soft cover to Hamas are also the people who tend to object to many of the pillars of Western civilization, such as free speech. They want to undermine our confidence in our history, in our culture. They tend to support radical points of view on race, on gender, on slavery, on colonialism. And it forms a suite of views that really, as you said in your introduction, it's an army of useful idiots that are the outriders for the actual jihadis of Hamas. And let's not forget, we have experienced the same sort of violence at a much lesser scale on our streets in London and in Manchester.
Yes.
They come to the Jews first, but they're coming to everybody next.
Indeed. Again, I think we can all vividly remember those terror attacks. It is interesting how much on the left that hatred of Britain and our past and our role in the world, hatred of America, again, anti-capitalism, Israel seen as somehow being used by the colonialist powers, the US and the UK, but also that classic anti-Semitic meme, this sort of idea that they're actually, controlling the West as well. I mean, it seems to always work both ways, whichever is more convenient. It is a completely legitimate thing for someone to be, whether they are Palestinian themselves or Muslim themselves or Brit, a non-Muslim Brit in this country who is concerned about the people of Palestine, the Palestinians, people of Gaza in particular. That is a legitimate concern to express and to say there's been this horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel. However, the missiles raining down and the invasion that is forthcoming by Israel is going to hurt ordinary civilians in Gaza far more than it's going to hurt Hamas. That is it not, a perfectly legitimate concern for everyone to raise, no?
Look, war is hell. War is hell. And not just the Palestinian victims are legitimate people of concern. But the Palestinian cause, I'm not saying that it's wrong to support the Palestinian cause in general. This is a very complicated situation. And there is an Overton window within which reasonable criticism is perfectly justified. But I think that at the same time, there's a certain lack of awareness in our country, sitting in our comfortable homes in London or elsewhere in the country, for what it means to be under existential threat in wartime. And if we think back to how we behaved and how the Americans behaved when we were under attack, after 9/11, which happened in America, obviously not in Britain, we invaded Iraq. And we all know, there were about 200,000 people killed.
Afghanistan first, and later Iraq was linked to
Afghanistan
that,
and then Iraq. But in Iraq, we killed about 200,000 people in 3 years. And that wasn't even an existential crisis for us. I suppose the most recent existential crisis for us was the Second World War. And by the end of the Second World War, we firebombed Dresden. We killed 25,000 civilians. We burned them to death, the RAF. And so, it's very easy for us to wag our fingers and look at Israel and say, you're facing an existential crisis, but you've got to be nice. And I'm not trying to excuse human rights abuses, but I am trying to say there's a real difference of perspective.
Israel is held to a higher standard than others. I asked a Palestinian journalist who's in Gaza City at this moment, what would be a reasonable response? She talked about the Israelis were massacring Palestinian civilians with their bombing attacks right now. I asked her, goodness knows, like 10 times, what would be a reasonable and proportionate response to the massacre by Hamas? I could not get an answer that was, comprehensive. What is the reasonable response? Do you think that what is being planned, from what we are hearing, what is being planned, this grand invasion, the mass movement of more than 1 million people from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, switching off of the water and food supplies and everything, is that a reasonable and proportionate response?
Good question. I've got one or two friends in Gaza from my time as a foreign correspondent, and I spoke to one of them over the weekend, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. I felt it really personally because I know these people. Him and his family fleeing from their homes down to the south, they had, I think, 2 days left of water and food supplies, not knowing where the next bit of food or water is coming from. And he said, look, I'm just so tired, I can't even think straight at the moment. And that is devastating, and it pulls on all of our hearts. But I think that we need to think about what Israel is facing. This is the worst crime against humanity, against Jews, since the Holocaust. And Israel needs to defend itself in a very, very difficult situation. Like I said, war is hell. And Israel is doing everything it can to minimize civilian casualties by asking them to depart from the place of conflict to places of relative safety and so forth. But I think that really, from an Israeli point of view, enough is enough. As Golda Meir said, we'd rather be alive with a bad reputation than dead with a good reputation. By that, I don't mean that it's okay to carpet bomb civilians, but I think that we must recognize that Israel is trying to preserve civilian life as best as it can, while Hamas is intentionally trying to.
We'll have to leave it there. Jake Wallis-Simons,
I so appreciate
you joining us. Thank you very much indeed.